everybody, and welcome to my presentation. It's so exciting to be speaking to people from across the world. I think possibly there's been a hidden benefit of COVID, that we're participating in events like this so much more easily and so much more frequently than we ever used to. So it's great to talk to you from Australia. And I should introduce myself. My name's Kate Wilson, and I'm an adjunct associate professor at the University of Canberra and a lecturer and researcher in TESOL. And today I want to talk to you about feedback on writing and how we can really zap it up, turbocharge it with critical thinking. What we're going to do today is to think first of all about what critical thinking means, particularly in ELT. Then we'll move on to feedback on writing, and we'll talk about how that's changed, what works, what doesn't work, what the research tells us. And then I'd like to introduce you to a small action research project that my colleagues and I at the University of Canberra conducted some years ago, and the outcomes of that project. And what I really want to do is to set you a challenge to go off and do your own action research on feedback on writing and how you can get it turbocharged with critical thinking. So first of all, let's talk about critical thinking and what it means for ELT. Well, the most well-known and I think the most accessible taxonomy of critical thinking comes from Bloom and his associates, and it was revamped a bit by Anderson and Cresswell some years later. So I think many of you familiar with this diagram. I've chosen this particular representation because it matches the colors of the Insights on Demand website. But it's very clear and bold, isn't it? Anyway, you can also find out more about it from the paper that I contributed to the Cambridge Papers in ELT series on critical thinking in EAP. And on that site, I tried to link the verbs from Bloom's taxonomy with teaching in ELT. It just makes sense. It all fits together very well. As you can see from the diagram, at the most basic level in terms of critical thinking, we have recalling facts. And I think probably when Bloom was writing, rote learning was a little bit more accepted than it is today. We tend to have moved away from rote learning or simply recalling facts. We don't even really like the word facts any longer these days, do we? And I think more and more teachers are concentrating on helping their students to understand what they're learning or what they're learning about. And then when we move up through this pyramid, we move on to applying. So applying the knowledge that we've gained and the learning that we've been making, applying it in particular situations. And of course, our ELT learners have to do this all the time, don't they? They may have learned something about the past tense, but then they have to be able to apply that in their own meaning making. More and more, I think the concept of analyzing is coming into ELT. And I love the idea of students as language explorers, analyzing the language of other people's texts and their own, to see how the language is enabling the author, the speaker, to make meaning effectively for particular purposes and particular audiences. So that idea of analyzing language is so important, isn't it? And then, of course, we come on to evaluating, being able to evaluate what works well and what doesn't work so well. and why something is working well, not only in the texts that they're reading, but in their own writing, so that they can learn, our learners can learn to self-assess much more easily and effectively. And then, of course, at the apex of our triangle, we have creating. And that's what we're getting our students to do all the time, isn't it? We're asking them to create their own texts in the target language, creating written texts, participating in spoken events, and even creating meanings as they read. So all of the speaking, reading, writing, listening, macro skills that we're teaching in ELT involve also creating. So critical thinking in ELT is absolutely fundamental, I would argue. So let's move on now to think about feedback on writing. And I want to start off by talking a little bit about my own experience as a teacher and as a student of feedback on writing. Well, of course, I go back a long way. So when I'm talking about my experience as a student, it's really going some way into the past. And I was a student of French. And I struggled every fortnight. I think we had to submit an essay, and mine would come back covered in red pen, great big slashes through things. I always got 12 out of 20. Sometimes I got 14 out of 20. And it was such a struggle. The only written comment I got used to be barbarisme, which means something barbaric, borrowed from English. And I think that was probably an indication that I really wasn't thinking in French. I was thinking in English and trying to translate it. Anyway, thoroughly demotivating. I never, when I got my assignments back, I don't know, put them in a pile somewhere. I might even have put them in the bin for all I can remember, because I certainly never really analyzed the feedback that I was given. And I never really tried to apply anything from the feedback that I was given. So, and I was really unable to evaluate my own work. So the feedback really wasn't very helpful. So as a teacher, I tried to avoid that. And one of the most successful experiences, I suppose, as a teacher was when I was teaching academic writing to international students and non-English speaking background students in the university. And I got them to produce a portfolio, and every week they would contribute some writing to the portfolio, and I would try to give really interactive dialogic feedback to them. And above all, I encouraged them to really work on the feedback. And because of the portfolio, I could see what feedback had been given and could see whether they were actually acting on that feedback. So my experience as a student and a teacher really reflects some changing attitudes to feedback on writing. When I was a student, the product approach was still firmly in vogue. And so you can see that I was being given summative feedback, highly evaluative, nearly all negative, I have to say, teacher dominated, completely teacher controlled, very much a focus on surface grammar errors and vocabulary errors, but surface errors. And there was no follow-up at all. But as time went by, language teachers in general began to become more interested in a process approach to writing, where teachers would try to give constructive feedback. They were more aware of the affective effect of feedback and how negative feedback can be really destructive, whereas positive feedback can give you a nice little shot of endorphins and help to encourage your motivation. one of my students has recently introduced me to this idea of WWW and INT. WWW meaning what is working well, and INT being improve for next time. So it's a nice idea to give maybe 3 positive comments and 3 negative or encouraging comments. Let's not call them negative, though it's very difficult to get away from that, isn't it? And particularly in the process approach, students were encouraged to act on feedback and given opportunities to do so. This is more what we call formative feedback. So it's feedback for learning, to encourage you to learn through the feedback. And increasingly people are talking, or were talking in the, say, the 90s, in the noughties and 90s, about discursive and dialogic feedback. So where there's an interaction going on between the teacher and the student. And this is particularly common when we ask our students to write journals or diaries, for example, and you want to concentrate particularly on the meaning rather than the form. And so this kind of feedback is much more student-centered. And of course, it's very time-consuming. So that's a challenge to us. How do we overcome that? Well, the research on feedback on writing tends to reflect these 2 approaches to the teaching of writing. So on the one hand, we've got research which focuses on the acquisition of grammatical forms, really couched in second language acquisition research. And we've got lots of research from different angles which says, oh yes, it works very well. On the other hand, we have research which says that it doesn't work. For example, Truscott claims that none of the previous research has really proved what works and what doesn't work. On the other hand, we have a lot of research on writing, which is focused on, research on the feedback on writing, which focuses on more on the text and the discourse level. How can writers better achieve the communicative purposes of their writing? And I recommend McGarrel and Verbeam's research, for example. Storch and Wrigglesworth suggest that actually none of the previous research has been very conclusive, because there are so many linguistic and affective factors confounding the research. So for myself, and perhaps I shouldn't say this in the context of this Cambridge webinar on research and the value of research, but for myself, I tend to be somewhat skeptical on the value of some earlier research. However, I did recently come across something which really stopped me in my tracks. A lot of new attention has been devoted to automated feedback and the value of automated feedback on writing. It's great, saves time and deals with surface errors very efficiently. So this article by Liao in the ELT journal made me think twice. So Liao was looking at the application of a particular software in Taiwanese university, and you can see here the kind of feedback that was given by this software. So this particular example here, I don't know if you can read it very well. It says this subject and verb may not agree. May not agree. Notice the hedging there. The software is actually calling on the students to think critically about their own work. It's not saying they don't agree, it's saying they may not agree. Proofread the sentence yourself to make sure the subject agrees with the verb. So it's calling on students to think critically, to take responsibility. And I think you can see here the link with learner autonomy. And this software also gives a numerical analysis of the errors which are being made in the student's writing. So how many fragments, how many run-on sentences, how many garbled sentences, etc., etc. And so again, this can engage the students' critical thinking because the students can look for themselves to see how well they are writing and what improvements they are making in their writing. Though I do have a bit of a problem with it because sentence fragments, well, they can be useful at times, can't they? Are they always errors? So we have to take this kind of feedback with a grain of salt. And again, we need to get our students really thinking critically about it. And I think if we look more closely at the student's text, so I've transcribed it here so that you can read it more easily, you can see that the issues that she's got are actually much more serious than those surface, easily fixable, what can be called treatable errors. In my senior high school, I had two unforgettable teachers called Tina and Jacob. Tina is a serious teacher. She thinks that students could learn much more when doing their homework. She asks us to hand in 2 reports once a week. 2 reports once a week. I enjoy happy atmosphere. So at the beginning of semester, I didn't like her because I thought students should get the knowledge that when they were enjoying their lessons, she's not really getting her meaning across very well here, is she? Jacob, a prepossessing teacher, is known for his attitude to everyone on campus. He is the one who made me satisfy in my senior high. He devoted to give us relaxed and happy atmosphere so that everyone could enjoy the class and get the knowledge straightly. What? I'd really loved him when learning. So you can see that there are some issues here. For example, how is this student using the dictionary? Prepossessing, it looks very much as if it's a dictionary usage problem, doesn't it? And so we really need to get this student thinking about how they're using dictionaries, for example. And they've got also problems with sentence, with formulaic language, haven't they? Chunking of language. And so there are many more issues here that this student really needs to think about other than these surface treatable errors. So now many researchers are calling for a different approach to research on the feedback of writing. They're looking for more socio-culturally based research, and particularly looking at the role of student and teacher, the role of students as active agents in eliciting and acting on feedback, and teachers' role in scaffolding their learners' development over time. As Chong says, in the dialogic approach to feedback, so that's where we're changing the role of teachers and students. He says a closer relationship between the teacher and students needs to be forged, and students have to take ownership of the feedback they receive and transfer it into learning resources that benefit their learning. So in order to answer these sort of questions about the role of teachers and students and the relationship that's forged and the autonomous and critical thinking that students engage in, we have to take a different attitude to research. So now I want to introduce you to an action research project that my colleagues and I conducted at the University of Canberra. At the time, we were working in a section of the university which supported non-native speaker students in their writing. And often students would come to us sort of with their assignment, expecting us to fix it for them. So our problem was how to use feedback on their writing to get our students to become more independent learners and more critical thinkers. So stage 1 in action research, do some background research, do some reading. And we engaged with a number of authors. Particularly, we were interested in Lillis's work on dialogic feedback, how to engage students in collaborative dialogue. So shifting the power structure more towards the student, but also providing directive feedback when it was necessary. And Cambarellis called this a sort of hybrid discourse. Woodward Cron was also a significant influence on us from her work on the dialogic nature of interactions in one-to-one consultations. And so looking at teacher talk was a really important part of our research. Van Leer says that these moment-to-moment interactions between teachers and students require us to make just right and just-in-time responses. And this is among the most complex and demanding decisions that experienced teachers have to make. So, okay, so we had our question, we had our background research, and then we had to gather some data. So we recorded some of our one-to-one consultations with our students, with their permission, of course, and with ethics permission from the university. And we transcribed that data and analyzed it. And we used our framework of one discourse in one-to-one consultations, looking at a continuum between didactic and collaborative discourse. And also we looked for evidence of what Vygotsky called microgenesis, the student evidence of the student actually learning on a moment-to-moment basis through our interaction in the session. So stage 3, and you'll find these stages of action research in Anne Burns' book, highly recommended. So stage 3 of action research. So you need to look at your data, immerse yourself in the data, reflect on it, discuss it, revise it, reflect on it, and really work out what you're seeing in the data. And as a result of that, we came up after much discussion in our group with this set of strategies for feedback on writing, moving from the didactic, telling, giving information, and then modeling, for example, making our thinking and making the language visible for our students, through to more collaborative interactions, such as increasing perspectiveness. That's the idea of that is that through questioning, you push your students forward in their understanding. And then more collaboratively still, co-constructing understanding, and then finally abrogating power, hedging. You remember that example that I gave you before? You may think about this, you could think about that, asking questions. So we're shifting the balance of power more towards the student and away from the teacher, so that through finally active listening to students, back channeling, and giving positive feedback, we're really shifting the discourse more and more towards the students so that they take autonomous control of their learning. And we did indeed find some lovely examples of students moving from being quite dependent at the beginning of the session through to really taking control and leaving the session confidently knowing how they were going to progress their writing, what they were going to do better next time. What was that? INP, improve for, INT, improve for next time. And then stage 4 of action research is do it again. And so we did. And so once we'd identified these discourse strategies that we ourselves were using, we could try implementing them more consciously and gradually make changes in our practice, in our use of teacher talk. And through this, we were able to build up a community of practice amongst our group of practitioners. So I'm now going to hand over to you and give you a challenge. It's obvious that through our feedback, we want to get our students thinking critically and taking more control so that they can become autonomous learners. So this is obviously the key to getting them to act on feedback. How do you do that? How do you do that? What works best for you with your students and in your context? So rather than waiting for the research, for the literature to bring you definitive answers, and I'm not saying don't read the research, do, but read it with a critical eye. And rather than expecting it to bring you definitive answers about what you should or should not do in your feedback on writing, why not start to analyze your own practice and try to find solutions that work for you? Good luck, and thank you. There's lots of references for you, and I think that the PowerPoint slides will be available for you later.